There's no pain like a parent losing a child, and no guilt like knowing you were supposed to protect them. For 28 years, Daniel Cole has carried both burdens every single day since his 6-year-old son Tommy disappeared during a camping trip in the mountains. The police found only a sneaker and a crayon drawing Tommy had made of a building with a red cross. They called it an accident. Daniel knew better, but had no proof. Now retired and alone, Daniel gets an anonymous letter with a photograph. It shows an old, crumbling sanitarium deep in the forest. The building has a faded red cross on it. It matches Tommy's drawing perfectly. When Daniel visits the abandoned place, he finds his son's bracelet still wedged in a patient room wall. Even stranger, locals tell stories of a wild young man living in these woods. A man with familiar eyes who doesn't speak and runs from people. Could this be Tommy? And if it is, what happened to him all those years ago in that horrible place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Cole's hands hadn't stopped shaking since he'd opened the letter 3 hours ago. The anonymous envelope sat on his kitchen table like a loaded weapon, its contents spread before him. A single photograph and 5 typed words. You never stopped looking, did you? The photograph showed exactly what Tommy had drawn all those years ago. Every detail matched. The peaked roof, the arched windows, even the placement of that distinctive red cross on the white brick facade. But this wasn't a 6-year-old's crayon sketch. This was a real building, weathered and abandoned, vines crawling up its walls like grasping fingers. Daniel picked up the photo again, his calloused mechanic's fingers trembling against the glossy surface. 28 years he'd been carrying Tommy's drawing in his wallet, the paper soft and worn from countless examinations. 28 years of showing it to park rangers, hikers, local historians, anyone who might recognize the building. Everyone had shaken their heads. Never seen anything like that around here, Dan. You sure the boy didn't just imagine it? But Tommy hadn't imagined it. Tommy had been there. The autumn light filtering through Daniel's kitchen window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, reminding him of that last morning. October 15th, 1980, a perfect fall day for camping, crisp and bright with leaves painted in gold and crimson. Tommy had been so excited about their father-son weekend trip to Brambleton State Forest. He'd packed his little backpack the night before, carefully arranging his treasures, his wooden whistle, a bag of smooth river stones, and that box of broken crayons he'd gotten from the church donation pile. "Can we build a really big fire, Dad? Like the ones in the cowboy movies?" Tommy had asked, bouncing on his toes as Daniel loaded their gear into the old Ford pickup. "Sure thing, cowboy," Daniel had replied, ruffling his son's sandy hair. "Big enough to see from space." It was the last conversation they'd ever have. The campsite Daniel had chosen was secluded, nestled in a grove of oak trees, about 2 miles from the main trail. Perfect for a father who worked 60-hour weeks at Morrison's auto shop and wanted uninterrupted time with his boy. Too perfect, as it turned out. Too isolated for anyone to hear Tommy's cries. Daniel had woken that Saturday morning to find Tommy's sleeping bag empty, still warm, but vacant. The boy's shoes were gone, but his jacket remained hanging on a tree branch where he'd left it the night before. Daniel had called his name until his voice went hoarse, searched every inch of the surrounding forest until the park rangers arrived with their dogs and their grim expressions. The search had lasted 6 days. Volunteers from 3 counties had combed through thousands of acres of wilderness. They'd found Tommy's left sneaker caught on a bramble bush 1/2 mile from camp, and tucked underneath it, protected from the elements, was the drawing. A single sheet of paper torn from a composition book showing a building that shouldn't exist. "Children have vivid imaginations, Mr. Cole," the lead investigator had said. "When they're scared or lost, they sometimes create fantasy places in their minds. It's a coping mechanism, but Daniel knew better. Tommy wasn't a child given to flights of fancy. He was methodical, careful with details. When he drew their house, every window was in the right place. When he sketched their dog Rex, he remembered to include the white spot on his chest. Tommy drew what he saw. The official conclusion was death by misadventure. A 6-year-old boy who'd wandered from camp and succumbed to exposure or animal attack. The case file was thin, the investigation perfunctory. Small-town police departments in 1980 didn't have the resources for extended searches, and after a week without leads, everyone except Daniel was ready to accept the inevitable. But Daniel couldn't accept it, wouldn't accept it. The search consumed him. Every weekend for the first 5 years, he returned to those woods. He mapped every trail, explored every cave, followed every stream. He hired a private investigator with money he'd borrowed against the house. He placed ads in newspapers across 3 states, offering a reward for information. He contacted psychics, though he felt foolish doing it. He even traveled to other state forests, showing Tommy's drawing to anyone who would look. Sarah had tried to be supportive at first. She'd driven out to the woods with him those early weekends, calling Tommy's name alongside her husband, holding on to hope that their boy might still be out there somewhere. But hope is a luxury that few can afford for long. After 2 years of fruitless searches, Sarah needed to grieve. She needed to move forward. She needed a husband who could be present for the living instead of chasing shadows in the forest. "He's gone, Danny," she'd said one evening, her voice soft but firm. "Our baby is gone, and you're disappearing too. I can't lose both of you." But Daniel couldn't stop. Every lead, no matter how slim, demanded investigation. Every phone call from someone who thought they'd seen a building, like the one in Tommy's drawing, sent him racing across state lines. The marriage cracked under the weight of his obsession, hairline fractures that spread until the whole structure collapsed. The divorce papers were signed on a rainy Tuesday in March 1985. Sarah kept the house. She couldn't bear to stay, but she couldn't bear to let strangers live in Tommy's room either. Daniel moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above Mitchell's hardware store, taking only his clothes, his tools, and that worn piece of paper that had become his most precious possession. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of routine and regret. Daniel threw himself into his work, becoming the best mechanic in 3 counties. Cars didn't lie. Cars didn't disappear without explanation. Cars had problems that could be diagnosed and fixed. If only life were so simple. He'd tried dating a few times, well-meaning friends setting him up with widows or divorcees who understood loss. But no relationship could survive the competition with a ghost. How do you love someone whose heart belongs to a memory? How do you build a future with a man still living in 1980? Sheriff Morrison, who'd handled Tommy's case, had retired 5 years ago. On his last day, he'd stopped by Daniel's shop with a manila envelope. "These are copies of everything," Morrison had said, his voice thick with regret. "Official case is closed, but if you ever find anything new, anything at all, take it to my replacement. Promise me you won't give up completely, Dan. That boy deserved better than what we gave him." Daniel had promised, though by then his searching had become more ritual than investigation. He still drove out to the forest twice a month, still carried Tommy's drawing everywhere he went, still felt that familiar ache every time he passed a playground or saw a father with his son. But the burning urgency had cooled to a steady, manageable pain. He'd learned to live with the not knowing the way some people learn to live with chronic illness. It never goes away, but it becomes part of your daily landscape. Until today, until this photograph. Daniel studied the image again, noting details the photographer had captured. The building was larger than he'd imagined, 3 stories of institutional architecture that spoke of function over form. Windows were boarded up or broken, and what remained of the Red Cross was faded to a dull rust color. Vines and saplings had pushed through cracks in the foundation, nature slowly reclaiming what man had abandoned. But it was real. After 28 years of being told his son had imagined this place, here was proof that it existed. Somewhere in these mountains, this building waited for him to find it. Daniel reached for his truck keys, then stopped. He was 64 years old, retired for 3 years now, living on Social Security and the small pension from the auto shop. His knees creaked when he stood up too fast, and his vision wasn't what it used to be. Was he really going to chase another lead? How many times could a man's heart break before it simply stopped working altogether? But even as the doubts circled his mind, he knew he had no choice. Tommy was still out there. Maybe not alive. Daniel wasn't naive enough to believe in miracles, but his story was out there. The truth was out there. And someone had decided after all these years that Daniel deserved to know what had happened to his son. He folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into his wallet, right next to Tommy's drawing where it belonged. Then he stood up, ignoring the protest from his arthritic joints, and reached for his jacket. Time to finish what he'd started 28 years ago. The drive to Millbrook took Daniel 3 hours, through winding mountain roads he'd never traveled before. The photograph had no address, no identifying landmarks beyond the building itself, but something deep in his gut told him to head northeast, toward the most remote sections of the Appalachian foothills. He'd called in sick to his part-time job at Henderson's parts store, the first sick day he'd taken in 5 years, and loaded his truck with supplies as if he were heading out for a weekend camping trip. The GPS on his phone lost signal after the first hour, leaving him to navigate by instinct and the occasional hand-painted road sign. As the pavement gave way to gravel and then to dirt, Daniel began to wonder if he was chasing another phantom. How many wild goose chases had he embarked on over the years? How many promising leads had led nowhere? But this felt different. The photograph was too specific, too detailed to be a cruel hoax. Someone knew something about Tommy's drawing, and they wanted Daniel to find this place. The forest grew denser as he climbed higher into the mountains. Ancient oaks and maples formed a canopy so thick that even the October afternoon sun could barely penetrate to the forest floor. The air itself seemed older here, heavy with the scent of decomposing leaves and wild honeysuckle. This was wilderness that few people ever saw, the kind of remote territory where a building could stand for decades without anyone knowing it existed. Daniel almost missed the turnoff. A gap in the trees revealed what might once have been a driveway, now overgrown with brambles and saplings. Rusted posts flanked the entrance, and hanging from one by a single bolt was a weather-beaten sign. Millbrook Sanitarium, private property, authorized personnel only. His heart hammered against his ribs as he parked the truck and grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. The driveway was impassable to vehicles, choked with fallen branches and washouts from decades of mountain storms. Daniel pushed through the undergrowth, thorns catching at his jacket, following the ghost of an asphalt path that wound upward through the trees. The building emerged from the forest like something from a nightmare. It was exactly as Tommy had drawn it, and exactly as the photograph had shown, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. The scale was more imposing than he'd imagined. 3 stories of institutional brick architecture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The red cross on the facade was barely visible now, faded to the color of dried blood, but Daniel could make out its shape if he squinted. Every window on the ground floor had been boarded up with sheets of plywood that had weathered to silver gray. The upper floors showed broken glass like dead eyes, and ivy had consumed much of the eastern wall. A fire escape hung at a dangerous angle, its metal supports eaten through with rust. Daniel approached slowly, his feet crunching on broken glass and scattered debris. The front entrance was secured with a chain and padlock, but decades of weather had weakened the wooden doorframe. It would be easy enough to break in, though something about the building's silence made him hesitate. He circled the perimeter first, noting details. The foundation was solid stone, probably quarried locally, and showed signs of recent animal activity, maybe raccoons or possums denning in the basement. The back of the building had once featured a loading dock, now collapsed into a pile of rotting timber. And on the north side, he found what he was looking for. A window on the ground floor had lost its boarding. The plywood sheet hung by a single nail, creating a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Daniel tested the opening carefully, then pulled out his flashlight and climbed inside. The interior smelled of mold and decay, with an underlying chemical odor that made his nose wrinkle. His flashlight beam swept across a large room that had once been a common area or reception hall. Institutional furniture, metal chairs and tables, lay scattered and overturned. The walls were institutional green, the paint peeling in long strips that curled like old skin. Daniel moved deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Each room he explored told the same story: hurried abandonment. Filing cabinets stood open with papers scattered across the floors. Medical equipment lay where it had been dropped. In what had once been a kitchen, pots and pans still sat on industrial stoves, as if the cooks had simply walked away mid-preparation. It was on the second floor, in a room that had clearly been a patient ward, that Daniel found what he was looking for. The room contained 6 hospital beds, their metal frames rusted but intact. The mattresses had long since been claimed by mice and mold, but the beds themselves remained arranged in neat rows as if waiting for patients who would never come. Daniel played his flashlight beam along the walls, noting the scratches and gouges in the plaster where desperate hands had clawed at the paint. And there, wedged into a crack between 2 loose stones in the wall beside the third bed, something glinted in the flashlight beam. Daniel's hands shook as he worked the object free. It was small and tarnished, but unmistakably familiar. A silver bracelet, child-sized, with a small charm in the shape of a baseball glove. The inscription on the back was barely legible, worn smooth by years of handling, but Daniel didn't need to read it. He'd paid to have those words engraved 29 years ago. To Tommy, love Dad. The bracelet he'd given his son on his 6th birthday. The bracelet Tommy had been wearing when he disappeared. Daniel sank onto the edge of the rusted bed frame, clutching the small piece of silver to his chest. Tommy had been here, in this room, in this bed, in this place that shouldn't exist but did. His son had been here, and somehow, impossibly, he'd managed to hide this one precious link to home in a crack in the wall. The emotional impact hit him like a physical blow. 28 years of wondering, 28 years of not knowing, and here was proof that his search hadn't been in vain. Tommy hadn't simply wandered off and died in the woods. He'd been taken, brought to this place. But why, and by whom? Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and forced himself to think rationally. The bracelet was evidence, but evidence of what? The building was clearly some kind of medical facility, but why would a sanitarium want a 6-year-old boy? And why would they close down so abruptly, leaving everything behind? He spent another hour exploring the building, but found nothing else that connected to Tommy. No records, no personal effects, no clues about what had happened here or when the facility had been abandoned. But as he prepared to leave, something made him stop at the main entrance. The front door was secured from the outside with that heavy chain and padlock, but there were scratches in the wood around the lock, fresh enough that the bare wood still showed through the weathered grey surface. Someone else had been here recently, someone with tools and knowledge of how to pick locks. Daniel was examining the scratches more closely when he heard the voice behind him. "You're not the first one to come looking, you know." He spun around, heart racing, to find an elderly woman watching him from the edge of the tree line. She was small and weathered, wearing a faded floral dress and a wool cardigan despite the warm afternoon. Her white hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes were sharp and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, slipping the bracelet into his pocket. "I didn't mean to trespass." "I was just looking for answers about your boy," she said, stepping closer. "I'm Martha Henley. I live about a mile down the mountain. Been watching this place for years, wondering when someone would finally come asking the right questions." Daniel stared at her. "You know about Tommy?" Martha's smile was sad but knowing. "I know about a lot of things, Mr. Cole. I know about the children they brought here in the old days. I know about the men in suits who came asking questions after the place shut down. And I know about the wild man who's been living in these woods for the better part of 30 years. Wild man." Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Lives rough, avoids people, doesn't talk much when you do see him. But he's got your eyes, Mr. Cole. And sometimes, when the light hits him just right, he looks like he might have been a beautiful child once upon a time. Martha Henley's boarding house sat in a clearing, carved from the mountainside like something from another era. The two-story farmhouse had been built in the 1920s, she explained, originally as a hunting lodge for wealthy families from Charleston. She'd bought it 30 years ago when her husband died, turning it into a quiet retreat for hikers and researchers who needed a place to stay while exploring the remote wilderness areas. "Don't get many guests these days," Martha said, leading Daniel up the front porch steps. "Most folks prefer the chain hotels down in Beckley. But you're not most folks, are you, Mr. Cole?" Daniel's room was simple but clean, a single bed with a handmade quilt, a desk by the window, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin that actually worked. Martha charged him $20 a night, which included breakfast and all the coffee he could drink. More importantly, she was a repository of local knowledge that went back decades. That first evening, they sat on the porch as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. And Martha told him what she knew about Millbrook Sanitarium. "Built in 1962, she said, rocking slowly in her wooden chair. Officially, it was a private psychiatric facility for children with severe behavioral problems. Rich families from all over the South would send their troubled kids here for intensive treatment, the kind of place where you could make a difficult child disappear for a while, if you had the money and the right connections. But that's not what it really was," Daniel said. "It wasn't a question," Martha shook her head. "Dr. Heinrich Kruger ran that place like his own private kingdom. He had credentials from some fancy German university and theories about treating childhood mental illness that were, shall we say, ahead of their time. The parents didn't ask too many questions as long as their problems went away. What kind of treatments? The kind that would get you arrested today. Isolation therapy, sensory deprivation, experimental drugs. There were rumors about worse things, but nobody talked about them openly. This is a small community, Mr. Cole. People knew things weren't right up there, but Dr. Kruger had powerful friends. State officials, federal oversight committees, they all seemed very interested in protecting Millbrook's privacy." Daniel sipped his coffee, trying to process what he was hearing. "How does a 6-year-old boy from a camping trip end up in a place like that?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Martha's voice grew quieter. "The official patients, the ones whose families paid the bills, they came through proper channels. Referrals from psychiatrists, court orders, that sort of thing. But there were other children too. Kids who arrived without paperwork, stayed without records, disappeared without traces. Test subjects, I think so. Yes, Dr. Kruger was writing papers for medical journals, giving presentations at conferences. He needed subjects for his research, and sometimes you can't wait for the right patient to walk through your door." Daniel felt sick. The image of 6-year-old Tommy in that sterile, frightening place was almost too much to bear. "How long did it operate?" "Closed down suddenly in January 1981. One day there were cars coming and going, children's voices in the yard, staff arriving for work. The next day, nothing, empty, like someone had flipped a switch." "What happened?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her rocking chair creaking rhythmically. "Story I heard was that one of the older patients, a teenager who'd been there for years, managed to get word out to a relative. Someone with connections to the newspapers. There was going to be an investigation, maybe federal charges. So Dr. Kruger and his staff just vanished overnight. Took all the records, all the equipment they could carry, and left everything else behind. What about the patients? The official ones got transferred to other facilities. Their families came and picked them up. But the others, the ones without paperwork, nobody knows what happened to them." Daniel pulled Tommy's bracelet from his pocket, turning it over in his fingers. "Except at least one of them got away. The next morning, Daniel drove into the nearest town, a place called Copper Ridge that consisted of a gas station, a diner, and a combination post office and general store. The county library was housed in a converted church, staffed by a volunteer librarian named Mrs. Patterson, who looked old enough to remember the Civil War. Millbrook Sanitarium, she repeated when Daniel asked. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. What's your interest, if you don't mind me asking?" Daniel had prepared a story about researching local history for a book he was writing. It wasn't entirely a lie. He was researching history, just not for publication. Mrs. Patterson seemed satisfied with the explanation and led him to a filing cabinet filled with local newspaper archives. "We don't have everything digitized yet," she apologized. "But the paper did a series of articles about Millbrook in the early 80s. Might be what you're looking for." The articles were exactly what Daniel needed. The Copper Ridge Gazette had covered the sanitarium's closure in detail, though much of the reporting felt sanitized, as if the journalist had been working around facts that couldn't be printed directly. "Millbrook facility closes unexpectedly," read the headline from January 23rd, 1981. The article described the sanitarium as a pioneering treatment center for childhood behavioral disorders that had completed its research mission and was closing to allow staff members to pursue other opportunities. But, reading between the lines, Daniel could see the real story. There were mentions of irregular operating procedures that had come to light, concerns raised by former employees, and ongoing discussions with state regulatory agencies. The most telling detail was buried in the third paragraph. "All patient records have been transferred to appropriate medical facilities in accordance with federal privacy guidelines." Daniel found more pieces of the puzzle in subsequent articles. Dr. Kruger had left the state immediately after the closure, with no forwarding address. 3 former employees had been arrested on unrelated charges within 6 months of the facility's closure, though the charges were later dropped or reduced to misdemeanors. And there had been a fire at the county courthouse that same year, destroying several file cabinets worth of records from the health department. Someone had worked very hard to erase Millbrook Sanitarium from official history. The most important discovery came in an article from March 1981. 2 months after the closure, a local hiker had reported finding personal effects belonging to children scattered in the woods near the abandoned facility. The county sheriff had investigated and recovered various toys, clothing items, and drawings, but was unable to locate the owners. The items had been held for 6 months, then disposed of when no one claimed them. Daniel's hands trembled as he read the inventory list that had been printed with the article. Among the recovered items were several children's drawings depicting buildings and outdoor scenes, including one described as a crayon drawing of a large building with a Red Cross symbol. Tommy's drawing, the one found with his sneaker. It had been among the items recovered from the woods near Millbrook. But that raised a new question. If Tommy's drawing had been found near the sanitarium 2 months after his disappearance, how had it ended up back at the original campsite where the search teams found it? Daniel was pondering this inconsistency when Mrs. Patterson appeared at his shoulder. "Finding what you need?" she asked. "More than I expected," Daniel replied honestly. "Mrs. Patterson, do you remember when Millbrook closed? Were you living here then?" Her expression grew guarded. "I was. Worked at the post office in those days. Handled a lot of mail going to and from that place. What was your impression of it?" She glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. "Off the record? That place gave me the creeps. The mail they got, medical supplies, chemical shipments, things that seemed strange for a children's hospital. And the outgoing mail was always marked confidential or classified research. Didn't seem like any kind of treatment facility I'd ever heard of. Did you ever see any of the patients?" "Once or twice, when they brought kids into town for medical appointments. They looked," she paused, searching for the right word. "Scared. Not just nervous or unhappy, but genuinely frightened. And they never talked. Not one word, even when the doctor asked them direct questions." Daniel felt a chill. "What happened to Dr. Kruger?" "Disappeared like smoke. One day he was there, next day gone. Left his house fully furnished, car in the driveway, food still in the refrigerator. Sheriff went to check on him after neighbors complained about the smell of spoiled milk, found the place abandoned. Did anyone try to find him?" Mrs. Patterson's laugh was bitter. "Mr. Cole, I don't think anyone wanted to find him. Whatever was happening up at that place, there were people in very high positions who were happy to see it end quietly. Sometimes the best thing you can do with a bad situation is let sleeping dogs lie." But Daniel couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. Not when one of those dogs might be his son. That afternoon, he returned to the boarding house to find Martha waiting for him with a manila envelope. "Found this in my attic," she said. "Figured you might want to see it." Inside the envelope was a collection of photographs taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. They showed the sanitarium during its operating years, cars in the parking area, staff members in white coats, and in one image, a group of children in the courtyard. The children were too far away to identify individually, but Daniel could see that they ranged in age from very young to teenage. One photograph made his heart skip. It showed a man in a dark suit talking to Dr. Kruger beside a black sedan with government license plates. The man's face was partially obscured, but his posture suggested authority. "Federal authority, who took these?" Daniel asked. "My late husband, Frank. He was a journalist before we moved up here. Old habits die hard." He suspected something wasn't right about Millbrook and started documenting what he could see from public land. Never did anything with the photos, though. Said he got warned off the story by people who could make his life very difficult. Daniel studied the images more carefully. "This looks like a federal agent." Frank thought so too. Said he'd seen the same man around town several times during Millbrook's operation, always asking questions about local families, local children. Frank started to think the federal government wasn't just aware of what was happening at Millbrook, they were sponsoring. The hidden compartment in Dr. Kruger's office was so well concealed that Daniel almost missed it entirely. He'd returned to Millbrook the morning after reviewing Martha's husband's photographs, determined to search the building more systematically. The administrative offices were on the third floor, and most had been thoroughly ransacked, filing cabinets overturned, desk drawers pulled out and emptied. Even sections of wall paneling pried away, as if someone had been searching for hidden safes. But Dr. Kruger's corner office was different. It showed signs of hasty packing rather than vandalism. The desk was clear except for a thin layer of dust, and the bookshelves still held volumes on psychology and behavioral modification. It was while running his hands along the built-in bookshelf that Daniel discovered the section that moved. A firm push on the right spot caused a panel to swing inward, revealing a space about the size of a shoebox. Inside were 3 items: a leather-bound journal, a manila folder containing photographs, and a small glass vial filled with white powder. Daniel carried his discoveries to the desk and opened the journal first. Dr. Heinrich Kruger's handwriting was precise and clinical, each entry dated and categorized. The early entries read like legitimate medical notes, patient assessments, treatment plans, medication schedules. But as Daniel read further, the entries became increasingly disturbing. Subject 23 shows remarkable adaptation to isolation protocols, read one entry from March 1975. After 72 hours of sensory deprivation, subject became significantly more compliant and responsive to suggestion. Recommend extending protocol to 96 hours for optimal behavioral modification. Subject 23. Not a patient with a name and history, but a test subject identified only by number. Daniel flipped through more pages, his stomach churning at what he read. Experiments with drugs that induced hallucinations. Children kept in soundproof rooms for days at a time. Aversion therapy that sounded more like torture. And throughout it all, Dr. Kruger's clinical detachment, as if he were documenting laboratory experiments with lab rats rather than human children. The younger subjects show greater neuroplasticity, noted an entry from 1978. Children acquired before age 8. It demonstrates superior capacity for memory suppression and behavioral reconstruction. Recommend expanding acquisition protocols to include subjects as young as 5 years of age. Acquisition protocols. They weren't just treating children who came to them, they were actively seeking out specific types of children for their experiments. Daniel found references to external procurement and field acquisition teams that made his blood run cold. There were coded references to camping sites, hiking trails, and isolated recreation areas where suitable subjects might be found. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Tommy hadn't been taken randomly. He'd been specifically targeted, identified as a good candidate for whatever hell they were running at Millbrook. The folder contained photographs that Daniel almost couldn't bear to look at. Images of children in sterile white rooms, some strapped to beds, others sitting motionless in chairs with electrodes attached to their heads. The children's faces were blank, emotionless, as if their personalities had been erased. In several photos, Daniel could see Dr. Kruger in the background, taking notes or adjusting equipment, but it was the final section of the journal that broke Daniel's heart completely. Starting in 1979, Dr. Kruger had begun detailed documentation of a new subject he referred to only as S-47. The descriptions matched Tommy perfectly. Age, height, hair color, even the small scar on his left knee from a bicycle accident, S-47, acquired October 16, 1980, from Brambleton State Forest. Subject age 6 years, excellent physical health, high intelligence quotient based on preliminary assessment. Beginning with standard intake protocols, 24-hour observation period, medical examination, baseline psychological evaluation, October 16, 1980, the day after Tommy had disappeared from their campsite. Daniel's hands shook as he read Dr. Kruger's detailed documentation of what they'd done to his son. Isolation chambers, drug trials, something called memory fragmentation therapy that seemed designed to erase a child's sense of identity. The entries described Tommy's resistance to the treatments, his attempts to escape, his gradual breakdown under the relentless assault on his developing mind. S-47 continues to demonstrate unusual resilience, noted one entry from December 1980. Despite 8 weeks of intensive behavioral modification, subject maintains strong attachment to pre-acquisition memories. Recommend implementing advanced memory suppression protocols. But then the entries about S-47 became less frequent, and by spring of 1981, they stopped altogether. The final reference was dated March 15, 1981, 2 months after the facility's official closure. S-47 remains non-compliant despite extended treatment protocols. Subject has become increasingly aggressive and unpredictable. Recommend transfer to secure long-term containment facility. Note, subject demonstrates exceptional survival instincts and problem-solving abilities. Continued observation may yield valuable data for future projects. After that, nothing. No record of what had happened to Tommy, where he'd been transferred, or whether he'd survived whatever they'd done to him. Daniel closed the journal and sat in the dusty office, overwhelmed by grief and rage. His 6-year-old son had been subjected to months of systematic psychological torture by people who saw him as nothing more than a laboratory animal. The boy who'd loved building blanket forts and feeding ducks at the pond had been transformed into S-47, a number in a medical journal. He was startled by the sound of his phone ringing. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, his ex-wife calling from the small house in Virginia where she'd moved after their divorce. Daniel hesitated before answering. He hadn't spoken to Sarah in almost 2 years, and their last conversation had ended badly, with her accusing him of being unable to let Tommy go and him accusing her of giving up too easily. "Hello, Sarah." "Danny?" Her voice sounded older, more fragile than he remembered. "I had the strangest thing happen today. A man came to my door, asking questions about Tommy. Said he was writing a book about missing children from the 1980s. Daniel's blood went cold. "What kind of questions?" "Details about the camping trip. Whether we'd ever found any additional evidence. Whether we'd ever suspected Tommy might have been taken rather than lost." She paused. "Danny, he knew things. Specific things about the case that were never made public. Things only the police and the family would know. What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I didn't like the way he looked at me when I said I didn't want to be interviewed. Like he was measuring me for something. And Danny, he had a federal ID badge." Daniel felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I found out what happened to Tommy." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Daniel thought the call had dropped. "You found him?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I found where he was taken. There was a place, a medical facility that was doing experiments on children. Tommy was there for months before it closed down. Is he? Sarah couldn't finish the question. I don't know. The records stop when the place shut down. But Sarah, there's something else. People around here have seen someone living wild in the forests. A man about the right age, with the right physical description. I think Tommy might have survived. I think he might still be out here. The sob that came through the phone was raw and heartbreaking. After all these years, oh God, Danny, what if he's been out there this whole time? What if he needed us, and we weren't looking in the right places? We didn't know where to look, Daniel said softly. But I know now, and I'm going to find him. I'm coming up there. Sarah, you don't need to. He's my son too, Danny. I should have kept looking. I should have believed you when you said he was still alive. I'm coming up there, and we're going to bring our boy home. After the call ended, Daniel sat in Dr. Kruger's abandoned office, surrounded by the evidence of his son's suffering, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 28 years, hope mixed with purpose. Tommy was alive, damaged, traumatized, living like an animal in the wilderness, but alive. And now Daniel knew the truth about what had been done to him, but he also knew that powerful people had worked hard to cover up Millbrook's crimes, and they might not appreciate someone digging up the past. The federal agent asking questions at Sarah's house wasn't a coincidence. Someone was monitoring their investigation. Daniel carefully photographed every page of Dr. Kruger's journal with his phone, then returned the original to its hiding place. If something happened to him, at least there would be a record of what he'd found. Then he gathered up the manila folder and the mysterious vial, stuffing them into his jacket. As he prepared to leave the building, Daniel noticed something he'd missed before. Fresh footprints in the dust of the main corridor, leading from the front entrance toward the back of the building. Someone else had been here recently, someone wearing modern hiking boots with a distinctive tread pattern. Daniel followed the footprints to a rear exit he hadn't discovered before. The door was slightly ajar, held open by a small stone. Beyond it, a narrow trail led into the dense forest. The footprints continued for about 50 feet before disappearing onto bare rock. Someone had been watching him, someone who knew he was coming and wanted to remain unseen. The question was whether that someone was friend or foe. Daniel looked back at the dark bulk of Millbrook Sanitarium, then at the forest trail disappearing into the shadows. Somewhere out there, Tommy was waiting. His son, now 34 years old, shaped by experiences Daniel could barely imagine, but still his son, time to start tracking. But as Daniel stepped onto the forest trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted as much as he was hunting. The game that had started with Tommy's disappearance 28 years ago was far from over. In fact, Daniel was beginning to suspect it was just getting started. Daniel's search for the wild man began at dawn 3 days later. He'd spent the intervening time studying topographical maps, marking water sources and cave systems where someone might take shelter. Martha had provided additional intelligence from her network of local contacts. Hunters, hikers, and old-timers who knew these mountains better than any government survey. Most recent sighting was 2 weeks ago, she told him over breakfast. Old Pete Mullins was checking his deer stands up near Raven's Gap when he saw someone moving through the trees about a quarter-mile away. Said the man moved like he knew the forest, never broke a branch or made unnecessary noise. Daniel had purchased proper hiking gear in town. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag rated for mountain temperatures, water purification tablets, and enough freeze-dried food for a week in the wilderness. He wasn't 25 anymore, but 40 years of physical labor had kept him in decent shape. More importantly, he had something driving him that most hikers lacked, the absolute certainty that his son was out there somewhere. The trail from Millbrook led generally northwest, following an old ridgeline that connected several peaks. Daniel moved carefully, stopping frequently to examine the ground for signs of passage. He found them: broken twigs, disturbed leaves, the occasional partial footprint in soft earth. Someone had definitely been using this route, and recently, on the second day, Daniel found the first shelter. It was ingeniously constructed in a natural depression between two large boulders, camouflaged so well that he almost walked past it entirely. Branches had been woven together to create a lean-to that was nearly invisible from more than 10 feet away. Inside, Daniel found evidence of long-term occupation, a sleeping area lined with pine needles and moss, a fire pit with cold ashes, and several tools crafted from forest materials. The craftsmanship was impressive. Whoever had built this shelter understood wilderness survival at an expert level. But more intriguingly, Daniel found evidence that the shelter's inhabitant had been watching Millbrook Sanitarium. A small cache hidden beneath a flat stone contained several items that made Daniel's heart race. A pair of binoculars, a notebook with hand-drawn maps of the area around the sanitarium, and photographs. The photographs were crude but effective, taken from long range with an old camera, showing various people entering and leaving the abandoned building over what appeared to be several years. Daniel recognized Martha's truck in one image, and in another, he saw his own Ford pickup parked near the sanitarium's entrance. Someone had been documenting visitors to Millbrook for years. Someone who was interested enough to maintain surveillance, but careful enough to remain hidden. The notebook was even more revealing. The maps showed not just the area around Millbrook, but a network of trails, shelters, and observation posts scattered throughout the mountains. Notes in the margins, written in a cramped but legible hand, described patrol patterns of federal agents, the schedules of local hikers, and detailed observations about wildlife behavior, but it was the final item in the cache that broke Daniel's heart. Wrapped carefully in an old piece of canvas was a carved wooden bird, about the size of Daniel's palm. The craftsmanship was rough but recognizable, definitely a cardinal, complete with a pointed crest and detailed wing markings. The wood was dark with age and handling, smoothed by countless hours of careful carving. Daniel remembered making a similar bird for Tommy when the boy was 4 years old. Tommy had carried it everywhere for months, talking to it as if it were a real pet. When they'd found Tommy's abandoned campsite, the wooden cardinal had been among the missing items, taken along with his son into whatever nightmare had followed. This carved bird was similar but not identical. The proportions were slightly different, the technique more mature, as if someone had tried to recreate a cherished memory using only the faded recollections of childhood. Daniel pocketed the wooden bird and continued his search with renewed urgency. He was close now. Tommy had been here, probably within the last few days. Somewhere in these mountains. His son was living like a ghost, watching from the shadows, maintaining a careful distance from the world that had failed to protect him. The third day brought rain, a steady mountain drizzle that made tracking nearly impossible. Daniel took shelter in his tent and studied the maps he'd found, trying to understand the pattern of movement they revealed. The shelters were positioned strategically, each one offering a view of important landmarks while remaining hidden from casual observers. Taken together, they formed a surveillance network that could monitor most human activity in a 20-square-mile area. It was the work of someone with military or intelligence training, or someone who'd learned through decades of necessity how to remain invisible. When the rain stopped that evening, Daniel heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the dripping of wet branches. A whistle, low and melodic, carrying the tune of an old folk song. Daniel recognized it immediately, Red River Valley, a song he used to sing to Tommy during those camping trips so long ago. The sound came from somewhere upslope, maybe a quarter-mile away. Daniel packed his gear quickly and followed the sound through the wet forest, moving as quietly as his aging joints would allow. The whistling stopped and started seemingly at random, as if the whistler was moving through the trees. Pausing occasionally to listen for pursuit, Daniel tracked the sound for almost an hour before he lost it entirely. He was preparing to make camp when he noticed the gift. It was placed carefully on a fallen log, directly in his path, a position where it couldn't be missed but could be easily retrieved without approaching too closely. Another carved wooden figure, this one depicting a man and a small boy sitting beside a campfire. The detail was remarkable, despite the crude tools that must have been used to create it. The man wore a baseball cap and held a fishing rod. The boy was looking up at the man with obvious adoration. The message was clear: I remember you, I remember us, but I'm not ready to come closer. Daniel placed his own message beside the carving, the silver bracelet he'd found at Millbrook, polished clean and wrapped in a piece of cloth. If Tommy wanted proof that Daniel knew the truth about what had happened, this would provide it. The next morning, the bracelet was gone. In its place was a new carving, this one showing a boy in a cage, hands pressed against the bars. Beside it was a simple drawing scratched into the dirt with a stick, the same Red Cross symbol from Tommy's childhood drawing, but with an X carved through it. Daniel understood. Tommy was telling him that he knew Daniel had found Millbrook, knew what had been done there, and approved of the implied promise that those responsible would be held accountable. But the caged boy carving suggested something else, that Tommy still felt trapped, even after all these years of freedom. Over the following days, Daniel established a routine. He would leave small gifts, food, tools, sometimes just a note, at locations where he'd found Tommy's carvings. In return, he would find new wooden figures that told pieces of Tommy's story. A boy running through dark woods, a man in a white coat holding a syringe, children huddled together in what looked like a prison cell. Each carving was a window into the trauma that had shaped his son's life. But it was the most recent carving that convinced Daniel his approach was working. It showed two figures, clearly a man and a younger man, standing on opposite sides of a river, reaching toward each other. The gap between them was small, but still significant. They were close to bridging it, but not quite there yet. Daniel was studying this latest carving when he became aware that he was being watched. The feeling was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, but it grew stronger as the afternoon wore on. Someone was observing him from concealment, and they were good at it. He pretended to busy himself with setting up camp while actually scanning the forest for any sign of his watcher. It was Martha's advice that finally helped him locate the source of his unease. "Don't look for the person," she'd said. "Look for what doesn't belong. A shadow that's the wrong shape, movement that doesn't match the wind, colors that don't fit the season." Daniel found him 40 yards away, perfectly still behind a screen of mountain laurel. At first glance, he looked like part of the forest, hair and beard gone grey-brown, clothing that might have been any color originally, but had faded to the neutral tones of bark and stone. He was thin, but obviously strong, with the wiry build of someone who lived entirely off the land, but it was the eyes that confirmed what Daniel had known in his heart for days. Even across the distance and through the intervening brush, those eyes were unmistakably familiar. Tommy's eyes, in the face of a man who'd been forced to grow up too fast and too hard. Daniel made no sudden movements. Instead, he sat down slowly on a fallen log and pulled out the wooden cardinal he'd found days earlier. He held it up so Tommy could see it, then placed it carefully on the ground beside him. "I know who you are," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the hidden watcher. "I know what they did to you, and I know you've been taking care of yourself all these years because you didn't think anyone was coming for you." The figure in the bushes didn't move, but Daniel sensed a change in the quality of attention focused on him. "I should have found you sooner," Daniel continued. "I should have known to look for that building. I should have understood what your drawing meant. I failed you then, but I'm here now. And I'm not leaving without you." For several minutes, nothing happened. Then slowly, the figure began to move closer, not directly toward Daniel, but in a wide circle that gradually decreased the distance between them while maintaining multiple escape routes. It was the careful approach of someone who'd learned through bitter experience that even apparent safety could be a trap. When Tommy finally stepped into the small clearing where Daniel had made camp, the full impact of their reunion hit both men like a physical blow. 28 years collapsed into a single moment of recognition and loss and desperate hope. Tommy looked exactly like Daniel had imagined, and nothing like he'd expected. The bone structure was the same, and those eyes were definitely inherited from his father. But this was a man shaped by experiences that normal people couldn't comprehend. Every movement was economical and purposeful. Every pause suggested careful evaluation of potential threats. He held himself like someone who'd learned that survival depended on constant vigilance. "Tommy?" Daniel's voice broke on his son's name. The man who had been Tommy tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to respond to a name he hadn't heard in decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, but unmistakably intelligent. "They called me S-47, he said simply. "But I never forgot my real name." The reunion Daniel had dreamed about for 28 years was nothing like he'd imagined. There was no running embrace, no tears of joy, no movie-perfect moment of father and son finding each other again. Instead, there was careful distance, cautious conversation, and the constant awareness that the man standing across from him was both his beloved child and a complete stranger. Tommy. Daniel forced himself to think of him by his real name. Not the clinical designation those monsters had given him, agreed to share Daniel's camp for the night. But he made it clear this was a temporary arrangement, subject to immediate cancellation if he sensed any threat. "You don't understand what they did," Tommy said as they sat by a small fire that evening. "It wasn't just the experiments. It was the systematic destruction of everything that made me who I was. They wanted to see if they could completely rebuild a human personality from scratch." Daniel listened as his son described memories that no parent should ever have to hear. Months of isolation in soundproof rooms, drugs that induced hallucinations so vivid that Tommy had lost the ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare. Behavioral modification sessions that sounded like sophisticated torture designed to break a child's will completely. "The worst part wasn't the pain," Tommy said, his voice steady but distant. "It was when I started to believe what they told me, that my family had abandoned me, that I'd imagined my life before Millbrook, that I was nobody and nothing except what they made me." "But you didn't believe it completely," Daniel said. "You kept the memory of our camping trips. You remembered the songs I used to sing." Tommy nodded slowly. "There was a part of me they couldn't reach. I don't know why. Maybe I was too young when they took me, or maybe I was just stubborn. But there was always this small voice in the back of my mind saying, 'This is wrong. This isn't who you are. Your real father loves you and he's looking for you.' I never stopped looking," Daniel said quietly. "Not for a single day. I know. When I escaped during the evacuation, I made my way back toward the camping area where they'd taken me. I hoped you might still be there. But it had been months. I was different, damaged. I didn't know how to be around people anymore." Daniel felt the weight of all those years pressing down on him. "I was there. I went back to that campsite dozens of times over the years. If I'd known to look for you, you wouldn't have recognized me," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "They'd changed me too much. I was feral, frightened of every human contact. It took me years just to remember how to trust my own thoughts." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made Tommy instantly alert, the distant hum of an engine, growing closer. In one fluid motion, he was on his feet, the fire scattered and extinguished, the campsite suddenly invisible in the darkness. "We need to move," Tommy said urgently. "Now." Daniel grabbed his gear and followed his son into the forest, trusting Tommy's knowledge of the terrain, even though he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. They moved for almost an hour through dense undergrowth, Tommy leading them along paths that seemed to exist only in his memory. Finally, they stopped in a natural shelter formed by overlapping boulders. Tommy motioned for silence and disappeared into the darkness. Daniel waited, straining his ears for any sound of pursuit, until Tommy returned 20 minutes later. 3 vehicles, Tommy reported. Black SUVs with government plates. "They're setting up a search perimeter around our old campsite. Someone's been tracking you." Daniel thought about the federal agent who'd visited Sarah, the feeling of being watched during his research in town, the fresh tire tracks he'd noticed near Martha's boarding house. "How did you know they were coming?" Tommy pulled something from his jacket, a small electronic device that Daniel didn't recognize. Scanner picks up radio transmissions on federal frequencies. I've been monitoring government activity in this area for years. Years! How long have you known they were still looking for you? They never stopped, Tommy said grimly. Millbrook wasn't shut down because of public outcry or federal investigation. It was relocated. The program continued at other facilities, and they've been very interested in recovering their escaped subjects. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. There are others like you? A few. Most of the children who went through Millbrook didn't survive the process. Those who did were either transferred to other facilities or, like me, managed to escape during the closure. But we're loose ends, walking evidence of crimes they can never allow to come to light. Tommy produced another item from his jacket, an ID badge in a clear plastic holder. The photo showed a stern-faced man in his 50s, and the text identified him as Agent William Collins, Department of Internal Security. Where did you get this? Daniel asked. Picked his pocket 3 years ago when he got too close to one of my shelters. Agent Collins has been running the recovery operation, trying to locate and contain former Millbrook subjects. He's been in these mountains on and off for the better part of a decade. Daniel studied the badge, remembering Sarah's description of the federal agent who'd questioned her. Is this the man who visited my ex-wife? Probably. Collins is thorough. He would have identified all family members of former subjects and put them under surveillance. Your decision to come looking for Millbrook triggered protocols they've had in place for years. The implications were staggering. Daniel had thought he was investigating a decades-old crime, but he'd actually stumbled into an ongoing operation. The people responsible for Tommy's suffering weren't safely in the past. They were still active, still dangerous, and still trying to cover up their crimes. What do they want with you now? Daniel asked. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of knowledge that Daniel found deeply unsettling. The Millbrook program never ended, Dad. It just went underground. Literally underground. There's a facility about 15 miles from here, built into an old mine complex. They've been continuing the research with new subjects, refining the techniques they developed at Millbrook. New subjects? You mean children? Taken from camping areas, hiking trails, anywhere parents might believe their kids simply got lost in the wilderness. The techniques are more sophisticated now, the cover-up more complete. But it's the same program, run by some of the same people. Daniel felt sick. How do you know this? Tommy pulled out a detailed map he'd drawn by hand, showing the location of what he called the underground facility. The map included access points, security measures, and guard rotations, because I've been watching them for years, documenting everything, waiting for the right moment to act. And because, Tommy's voice caught slightly, because I know there are children in there right now going through the same hell I went through. Children whose parents think they're dead or lost, but who are actually being systematically destroyed by people who see them as laboratory animals. Daniel stared at the map, understanding dawning slowly. You're planning to do something about it. I've been planning for years. But I needed help and I couldn't trust anyone. Too many people are compromised, and the program has protection at very high levels of government. I was starting to think I'd have to try alone, even though that would probably be suicide. But then I showed up. Tommy nodded. Then you showed up, asking the right questions, finding the right evidence. Someone I know I can trust because you're the one person in the world who has as much reason as I do to want these people stopped. Daniel looked at his son, this stranger who carried his eyes, and his stubborn determination, and felt the weight of 28 years of guilt and regret, crystallizing into something else, purpose, resolve, the chance to finally protect his child the way he should have protected him all. Those years ago, what do you need me to do? Daniel asked. Tommy's smile was the first truly genuine expression Daniel had seen from him. For just a moment, he looked like the 6-year-old boy who used to plan elaborate adventures in their backyard. Help me save them, Tommy said simply. All of them. And make sure the people responsible never hurt another child again. In the distance, They could hear the sound of search teams moving through the forest, their radio chatter occasionally audible on the scanner. Agent Collins and his people were closing in, but they were too late. The reunion they'd hoped to prevent had already happened, and it had created something they should fear much more than a traumatized survivor hiding in the woods. It had created a father and son with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The cave Tommy led him to was hidden so expertly that Daniel would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing the entrance. What appeared to be a solid rock face was actually a narrow opening, concealed behind a carefully arranged screen of dead branches and moss. Inside, the cave opened into a surprisingly large chamber that had been transformed into something between a military command center and a hermit's refuge. Battery-powered LED lights revealed the scope of Tommy's long-term project. One wall was covered with photographs, maps, and documents connected by colored string, like a detective's murder board. Another section contained surveillance equipment, cameras with telephoto lenses, recording devices, and multiple radio scanners. A third area held weapons that Tommy had clearly crafted himself: bows, spears, and knives made from scavenged materials, but showing professional quality workmanship. But it was the fourth wall that took Daniel's breath away. Dozens of photographs were arranged in careful rows, each showing a different child. Some images were clearly surveillance photos taken from a distance. Others appeared to be official pictures, school photos or family snapshots. Beneath each photograph was a file containing handwritten notes about the child's disappearance and dates, locations, circumstances, and follow-up information about the official investigations. How many? Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. 43 confirmed abductions over the past 15 years, Tommy replied, his tone matter-of-fact despite the horror of what he was describing. Probably more that I haven't been able to document. They've gotten very good at selecting targets and covering their tracks. Daniel studied the photographs more closely. The children ranged in age from about 5 to 12. And they'd been taken from locations across a 6-state area. But there was a pattern to the selections. All the children appeared healthy and intelligent, and most came from families that were either socially isolated or unlikely to generate sustained media attention. Single parents, recent divorces, families camping alone in remote areas, Tommy explained. Following Daniel's gaze, they look for children who can disappear without creating a major public outcry. Kids whose absence will be written off as tragic accidents rather than investigated as potential crimes. How do you know all this? Tommy moved to a section of the cave that Daniel hadn't noticed before, a work area where he'd been developing photographs in makeshift chemical baths. I've been documenting their operations for years, identifying their recruitment patterns, tracking their vehicles, photographing their personnel. He handed Daniel a manila folder containing what must have been hundreds of surveillance photographs. Images of children being loaded into unmarked vans, federal agents meeting with local officials, construction crews working on what appeared to be underground facilities, and throughout the collection, repeated appearances by Agent Collins and other government personnel. This is incredible evidence, Daniel said. Why haven't you taken this to the authorities? Tommy's laugh was bitter. Which authorities? The local sheriff, who gets federal funding for his department. The state police, who coordinate with federal agencies on terrorism prevention. The FBI field office that probably knows exactly what's happening, but can't act without jeopardizing national security. Daniel understood. The scope of the cover-up was too large for traditional law enforcement to handle. Too many people in positions of authority either knew what was happening or had been compromised in ways that made them unreliable allies. But there's something else, Tommy continued, pulling out a different folder. Something I discovered recently that changes everything. The photographs in this folder were different, taken with a modern digital camera rather than the older film equipment Tommy had been using. They showed the interior of what was clearly a high-tech medical facility, with examination rooms, laboratory equipment, and holding cells that looked more like prison than hospital accommodations. How did you get these? Daniel asked. Tommy smiled, and for the first time since their reunion, Daniel saw genuine pride in his son's expression. Turns out 28 years of living in the wilderness teaches you some useful skills. They can move through areas where other people can't go, access buildings that are supposed to be impregnable, and remain undetected in situations where normal surveillance would be impossible. You've been inside the facility multiple times. I've mapped the entire complex, identified security weaknesses, and documented their current operations. Tommy's expression grew grim. Dad, they have 18 children in there right now. 18 kids who are going through the same systematic destruction I experienced, only with techniques that are more refined and more effective. Daniel looked at the photographs again, this time focusing on the clinical details. The equipment was obviously state-of-the-art, and the facility itself looked like something from a high-budget research hospital. Whatever operation was running here had significant funding and official support. There's more, Tommy said, producing yet another folder. Financial records, personnel files, and operational documents that I've been collecting whenever I can access their computer systems. Computer systems. Tommy, how 28 years is a long time to teach yourself things. Dad, and when your survival depends on understanding your enemies, you develop a lot of specialized skills. The documents in this folder were stunning. Purchase orders for experimental drugs, personnel evaluations for doctors and technicians, and most damning of all, progress reports being sent to government agencies that officially didn't exist. Project Mindbridge, Daniel read from one of the reports. Funded through the Department of Advanced Research Initiatives under the oversight of the National Security Council. It's not just some rogue operation, Tommy explained. It's an official government program with oversight from the highest levels. They're trying to perfect techniques for memory manipulation, behavioral control, and psychological reconstruction that could be used for intelligence operations, military applications, or domestic population control. Daniel felt the full scope of what they were facing beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about Tommy or even about the other children who'd been victimized. This was about a government program that viewed human beings as expendable test subjects in the development of technologies that could threaten the foundation of free society. And the children are their laboratory. Animals, he said. Exactly. But Dad, here's the thing. They're almost ready to move to the next phase. According to the documents I've seen, they're planning to begin testing their refined techniques on adult subjects within the next 6 months. Political dissidents, whistleblowers, anyone they consider a threat to national security. We have to stop them. I've been trying to figure out how for years. The facility is too well defended for a direct assault, and they have too much government protection for legal approaches to work. But recently, I realized there might be another way. Tommy moved to a section of the cave that contained electronic equipment Daniel didn't recognize. I've been working on something. A way to get the evidence out to people who can't be silenced or intimidated. Journalists, human rights organizations, foreign governments who would be very interested to know what the United States is doing to its own children. What kind of equipment is this? Satellite communication gear, mostly surplus military hardware I've been collecting for years. With the right connections, I can transmit data anywhere in the world to multiple recipients simultaneously. Create an information explosion that would be impossible to contain or cover up. Daniel studied the setup, impressed despite his limited technical knowledge. You could expose everything. I could, but there's a problem. The transmission equipment requires me to be in a specific location for several hours while the data uploads. And that location is within sight of the underground facility. Once I start the transmission, they'll detect it immediately and come after me with everything they have. A suicide mission, probably. But if the information gets out, it might save the children currently in the facility and prevent future abductions. Sometimes that's the best you can hope for. Daniel looked around the cave again, seeing it now as the headquarters of a one-man war against an enemy that most people didn't even know existed. His son had spent 28 years preparing for a battle that he expected to lose. driven by the knowledge that children were suffering and no one else was coming to help them. "There's another option," Daniel said slowly. "What? You don't have to do this alone anymore." "You have help now," Tommy shook his head. "Dad, I appreciate—" "No, listen to me. You've been thinking like someone who has to handle everything by himself, because that's how you've survived for 28 years. But the situation has changed. You have allies now, people who know the truth and are willing to fight. People." Daniel pulled out his phone, grateful that he still had a weak signal this deep in the mountains. "Your mother is driving up from Virginia. She'll be here tomorrow. And I have contacts, journalists, lawyers, people who've been investigating government corruption for years. We can coordinate this properly, create redundancies, make sure the information gets out, even if something happens to us." For the first time since Daniel had found him, Tommy looked uncertain. "I don't know how to trust other people anymore, Dad. It's been so long since I had anyone to rely on, except myself." "I know. But that's exactly why this will work. They'll be expecting a lone wolf operation, something they can contain and cover up. They won't be prepared for a coordinated effort involving multiple people and multiple information channels." Tommy was quiet for several minutes, studying the evidence boards that represented years of solitary work. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay, but we do this my way, using my intelligence and my timeline. And if something goes wrong, if it looks like they're going to capture any of us, we abort everything and scatter. I won't be responsible for getting other people killed or captured." Daniel extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Tommy shook it. The contact was brief but meaningful, the first voluntary physical connection between father and son in 28 years. "Partners?" Daniel asked. "Partners," Tommy agreed. "Now let me show you exactly what we're up against." As Tommy began spreading out detailed floor plans of the underground facility, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible day in 1980. The absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. For 28 years, he'd been searching for his son. Now they were going to finish what had started with a 6-year-old boy's crayon drawing of a building that shouldn't exist. They were going to save the children. Sarah arrived at Martha's boarding house just after sunrise, driving the same blue Honda Civic she'd owned for 15 years, but looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. Her reunion with Daniel was awkward. 20 years of divorce and recrimination don't disappear easily, but their shared determination to help Tommy created an immediate alliance that transcended their personal history. "Where is he?" were the first words out of her mouth. "Safe," Daniel replied. "But Sarah, you need to understand, he's not the little boy who disappeared. 28 years of trauma have changed him in ways that are going to be hard to accept." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I don't care what they did to him. He's still my son." Martha served them coffee on the front porch, while Daniel explained what he'd learned about Millbrook, the ongoing government program, and Tommy's years of surveillance and planning. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more grim with each revelation. 18 children, she said finally. Right now, 18 children are going through what Tommy went through. Maybe worse, Daniel admitted. The techniques have been refined over the years. Tommy says the psychological destruction is more complete and more permanent. Then we stop it. Whatever it takes, we stop it. Daniel had contacted Helen Price, an investigative journalist he'd met years earlier while researching Tommy's disappearance. Helen had made a career of exposing government corruption and had the connections to get sensitive information to multiple news outlets simultaneously. She was driving up from Washington, D.C., and would arrive by evening, but it was Tommy's detailed facility map that became the centerpiece of their planning session. Spread across Martha's dining room table, it showed a complex that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The original mineshaft goes down about 200 feet, Tommy explained, pointing to the hand-drawn blueprints. But they've expanded it into a complete underground facility with 3 levels. Research laboratories on the first level, holding cells and treatment rooms on the second level, and administrative offices and living quarters for staff on the third level. How many people work there? Sarah asked. Varies. During normal operations, maybe 20 to 30 staff members. But they can bring in additional personnel for special projects. And they have security contractors who aren't on the regular payroll. Daniel studied the security arrangements Tommy had mapped out. What's our best approach? There isn't one, not for a direct assault. The facility has multiple layers of electronic security, armed guards, and emergency protocols that can lock down the entire complex in minutes. If we try to fight our way in, we'll be outnumbered and outgunned before we get past the first checkpoint. Then how do we get the children out? Tommy's expression was grim. We don't, not directly. The only way to save those kids is to expose the entire program so completely that the government has no choice but to shut it down and prosecute the people responsible. Helen Price arrived that evening, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for investigative reporting. She spent 3 hours reviewing Tommy's evidence, asking detailed questions and taking notes on her laptop. This is extraordinary, she said finally. The documentation is more complete than anything I've seen in 20 years of investigating government misconduct. But you understand the challenges we're facing. Explain them, Daniel said. First, the sources. Tommy is a credible witness, but his background makes him vulnerable to character assassination. They'll portray him as mentally unstable, a fantasist with grudges against the government. Second, the evidence was obtained through illegal surveillance and breaking into federal facilities. Defense lawyers will argue it's inadmissible. Third, the people we're accusing have enormous resources and political protection. They'll fight back with everything they have. So what do you recommend? Sarah asked. Overwhelming evidence delivered simultaneously to multiple outlets in different countries. We need to create such a massive information explosion that it becomes impossible to suppress or discredit. And we need to coordinate the release with law enforcement agencies that aren't compromised by the cover-up. Tommy had been quiet during most of the conversation, but now he spoke up. There's something else. Something I haven't told you yet. He produced another folder, this one containing what appeared to be personnel files for the facility staff. I've been documenting everyone who works at the underground complex. Scientists, administrators, security personnel, support staff. Some of these people might be willing to cooperate if they understood the full scope of what they're participating in. Helen examined the files. You think some of them don't know about the children? I think most of them don't know, Tommy said. The facility is compartmentalized. The researchers working on memory manipulation techniques might not know their work is being tested on kidnapped children. The security staff might think they're guarding a legitimate psychiatric research facility. Only the top-level administrators and the medical staff working directly with the subjects know the complete truth. That gives us leverage, Helen mused. If we can approach the right people with the right evidence, we might be able to turn some of them into whistleblowers. It's also incredibly dangerous, Daniel pointed out. If we approach the wrong person, or if our approach gets back to the administrators, they'll know we're onto them. Tommy nodded. Which is why we need to move fast once we start. Hit them from multiple directions simultaneously before they can implement their security protocols. Over the next 2 days, they refined their plan. Helen would coordinate with journalists and human rights organizations in 6 different countries. Sarah would contact legal advocacy groups and prepare media packages for rapid distribution. Daniel would serve as liaison with local law enforcement. Specifically, the new county sheriff who'd replaced Morrison and might be more willing to investigate federal crimes. But the most dangerous part of the operation would fall to Tommy. His surveillance equipment wasn't just for gathering intelligence. It was also capable of accessing the facility's computer systems during certain windows when their security protocols were relaxed. Every 3 days, they do a complete data backup to off-site servers, Tommy explained. During the backup process, which takes about 4 hours, their internal firewalls are temporarily reconfigured to allow large data transfers. That's when I can penetrate their systems and copy files directly from their main servers. How close do you have to get? Daniel asked. within a quarter-mile of the facility. There's a ridge that overlooks the main entrance where I can set up the equipment and maintain a line-of-sight connection to their communication array. That's suicide, Sarah said flatly. Once they detect what you're doing, they'll send everything they have after you. Not if we time it right, Tommy replied. The next backup window is in 2 days, starting at 2 a.m. If we coordinate our information release to begin at the same time I'm downloading their files, they'll be dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. Media attention, legal challenges, law enforcement inquiries, all hitting them while their own security is compromised. Helen looked up from her laptop. I can have reporters and camera crews at the facility. Entrance by dawn, if you can give me their exact location and timing, and I'll have legal injunctions. Ready to file the moment we have proof of current illegal activity, Sarah added. Daniel studied the map again, focusing on the ridge where Tommy would need to position his equipment. How long will it take to download everything? 3 to 4 hours, depending on how much data they're storing. But Dad, there's something else you need to understand. Once I start this process, there's no backing out. The download has to complete or we get nothing. And the longer I stay in position, the more likely it becomes that they'll locate me. Then you don't stay in position alone, Daniel said firmly. Dad, no arguments. If you're going to be on that ridge for 4 hours, you need someone watching your back. Someone who can provide cover if they send security teams after you. Tommy started to object, then stopped. For someone who'd spent 28 years relying only on himself, accepting help was almost as difficult as the mission itself. All right, he said finally. But if something goes wrong, if it looks like we're going to be captured, you leave me and get out. Promise me that, Daniel met his son's eyes. I'm not leaving you again, not for any reason. Martha had been quiet during most of the planning, but now she spoke up. You'll need a safe house. Somewhere to coordinate communications and retreat to if things go bad. My place is too obvious, but I have a hunting cabin about 10 miles north of here. It's off the grid, well supplied, and unknown to anyone outside the local community. That's perfect, Helen said. We can set up our communication hub there and maintain contact with all our media contacts. As the meeting broke up, Daniel found himself alone with Tommy for the first time since their reunion. His son was checking his equipment methodically, each piece of surveillance gear examined and tested with the precision of someone whose life had depended on mechanical reliability for decades. Are you scared? Daniel asked quietly. Tommy looked up from the radio scanner he was adjusting. Terrified, he admitted. But not for the reasons you might think. I'm not afraid of dying. I've been prepared for that possibility for years. I'm afraid of failing. Of those children spending the rest of their lives in that place because I wasn't good enough or smart enough or careful enough to save them. You won't fail. We won't fail. How can you be so sure? Daniel considered the question seriously because for 28 years I've been living with the knowledge that I failed to protect you when you needed me most. I won't make that mistake again. And because you've spent 28 years preparing for this moment, you know that facility better than the people who built it. You understand their weaknesses better than they understand them themselves. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Daniel had been dreading. What if we succeed? What if we expose everything and shut down the program and save those children? What happens then? What do you mean? I mean, what happens to me? I've been living like this for so long, I don't know how to be around people anymore. I don't know how to live in civilization. I don't even know if I want to. Daniel felt his heart break a little more. Then you don't have to. You don't have to do anything except what feels right to you. But you'll have choices, Tommy. For the first time in 28 years, you'll have real choices about how you want to live your life. And you'll be okay with whatever I choose. Even if I choose to disappear back into the wilderness, I'll be okay with whatever makes you happy, Daniel said honestly. But I hope you'll give us a chance to be a family again. Not the family we were before, but whatever kind of family we can be now. Tommy nodded slowly. I'd like that. After we finish this, I'd like to try to figure out what normal feels like. The next morning brought unwelcome news. Martha's scanner picked up increased federal radio traffic, and Tommy's surveillance equipment detected additional security personnel arriving at the underground facility. Agent Collins was mobilizing resources for what appeared to be a major operation. "They know something's up," Tommy reported during their emergency meeting at the hunting cabin. "Either they've detected my surveillance activities, or they've intercepted our communications somehow." "How much does that change our timeline?" Helen asked. "It accelerates everything. If they're bringing in additional security, it probably means they're planning to relocate the program within the next few days. If we're going to act, it has to be now." Sarah looked pale but determined. "Are we still going with tonight's schedule?" Tommy checked his watch. "The backup window starts in 18 hours. If we're going to do this, we need to be in position by midnight and ready to begin the download at exactly 2 a.m. "What about the additional security?" Daniel asked. "Makes it more dangerous, but doesn't change the fundamental plan. I can still access their systems during the backup window, and the ridge position is still our best option for maintaining the connection. We'll just have to be more careful about avoiding detection." Helen had been monitoring news feeds and government communication channels. "I've got reporters standing by in 6 different countries. The moment you start downloading their files, I can trigger a coordinated media blitz that will put so much spotlight on the facility that they won't be able to operate in secret anymore. And I've got legal papers ready to file the moment we have proof of current illegal activity," Sarah added. "Court orders demanding immediate access to the facility, injunctions preventing the destruction of evidence, emergency motions to place the children in protective custody." Daniel studied the facility map one more time, memorizing approach routes and escape paths. "Tommy, show me exactly where we'll be positioned and what kind of cover we'll have." Tommy traced their planned route with his finger. "We approach from the northeast, using this ravine to stay hidden until we reach the base of the ridge. Then we climb to this position here, which gives us line of sight to the facility's communication array while keeping us concealed from their security cameras." "How long will it take to set up the equipment?" "About 30 minutes to get everything positioned and calibrated. Then it's just a matter of waiting for the backup window to open. And once you start the download, 4 hours of absolute stillness. Any movement could break the connection and corrupt the data transfer. We'll be completely vulnerable during that time." Daniel nodded grimly. "Then we better make sure nobody finds us." As evening approached, the team made their final preparations. Helen established her communication center at the hunting cabin, with secure phone lines to journalists around the world and satellite internet for rapid data transmission. Sarah reviewed her legal documents one more time, making sure everything was properly prepared for immediate filing. Tommy and Daniel loaded their gear into Daniel's truck: surveillance equipment, camping supplies, and emergency medical kit in case something went wrong. They also packed the evidence Tommy had been gathering for years, multiple copies stored in waterproof containers and distributed among different hiding places. "If something happens to us," Tommy told Helen, "the backup evidence is hidden in these locations." He handed her a detailed map showing cache sites throughout the mountains. "Everything you need to expose the program is there, even if we don't succeed in downloading the current files." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Helen said firmly. "But thank you for the contingency planning." Martha provided them with additional local intelligence, weather reports, recent activity by federal agents, and safe routes through the forest that would minimize their chances of detection. "The forecast shows clear skies tonight, which is good for your equipment but bad for concealment," she warned. "And there's been unusual helicopter activity over the past 2 days. They might be conducting aerial surveillance. We'll take that into account," Tommy assured her. As they prepared to leave, Sarah approached Tommy hesitantly. This was only the second time she'd seen him since his return, and she was still struggling with how to relate to the damaged man her little boy had become. "Tommy," she said softly, "I want you to know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I stopped looking for you. I'm sorry I gave up hope. I should have believed your father when he said you were still out there." Tommy looked at her for a long moment, then stepped forward and embraced her gently. It was the first physical contact between mother and son in 28 years. "You couldn't have known," he said quietly. "And even if you had known, you couldn't have found me." "I didn't want to be found then. I wasn't ready. Are you ready now?" Tommy's smile was tentative but genuine. "I'm getting there." Daniel and Tommy drove toward the facility in darkness, following back roads that Tommy had mapped over years of surveillance. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. Position the equipment, download 4 hours' worth of classified government files, and escape before federal agents could locate and capture them. But as they approached their target, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The additional security, the increased radio traffic, the unusual helicopter activity, all of it suggested that Agent Collins knew exactly what they were planning and was waiting for them to make their move. "Tommy," Daniel said as they parked the truck and began preparing their gear, "what are the odds that we're going to walk out of this alive?" Tommy considered the question seriously. "Honestly, maybe 50-50. But Dad, the odds that those children will survive if we don't act are 0. And the odds that this program will continue to destroy more lives are 100%. Daniel nodded. Those were acceptable odds for a father who'd spent 28 years living with the knowledge that he'd failed to protect his child when it mattered most. "Then, let's go save some kids," he said. The approach to the ridge took them through 2 miles of dense forest, moving in complete darkness, with only the faint glow of Tommy's night vision equipment to guide them. Daniel followed his son's lead, amazed at how silently Tommy could move through terrain that would have left most people stumbling and crashing through the underbrush. They reached the base of the ridge at 11:30 p.m., exactly on schedule. From their position, Daniel could see the facility's entrance for the first time, an innocuous-looking concrete structure built into the hillside, disguised to look like a maintenance building for the old mining operation. But Tommy's whispered commentary revealed the sophisticated security measures hidden beneath the mundane appearance. "Motion sensors along the access road," Tommy murmured, pointing out devices that Daniel would never have noticed. "Infrared cameras covering the entrance. And those ventilation shafts you see are actually part of an air filtration system designed to prevent contamination from escaping the underground levels." They began the climb to their observation position, moving carefully up a steep slope covered with loose rock and thorny undergrowth. Tommy had done this dozens of times over the years, but for Daniel, every step was a challenge that tested his 64-year-old joints and cardiovascular system. "You okay?" Tommy asked during one of their brief rest stops. "I'll make it," Daniel replied, though his heart was pounding and his legs were beginning to shake from the exertion. They reached their target position at 12:45 a.m., giving them over an hour to set up the surveillance equipment before the backup window opened. The ridge provided perfect line-of-sight access to the facility while keeping them concealed behind a screen of boulders and scrub oak. Tommy's equipment was more sophisticated than Daniel had realized. In addition to the computers and radio gear, there were directional antennas, signal amplifiers, and what appeared to be some kind of electronic warfare device designed to penetrate the facility's firewalls. "How did you learn to do all this?" Daniel asked as he watched Tommy assemble the complex array of technology. 28 years of self-education," Tommy replied, connecting cables with practiced efficiency. "When your survival depends on understanding your enemies, you develop whatever skills you need. Electronics, computer programming, surveillance techniques, it's all just tools." By 1:30 a.m., everything was ready. Tommy ran final system checks while Daniel maintained watch on the facility below. The compound appeared quiet, with only minimal exterior lighting and no visible security patrols. "Something's wrong," Daniel said. "What do you mean?" "You said they brought in additional security personnel, but I don't see any evidence of increased activity. Where are all the extra guards?" Tommy looked up from his equipment, suddenly alert. "You're right. There should be more visible activity. If they've really upgraded their security posture." They studied the facility more carefully, using Tommy's binoculars to examine every detail of the visible structures. What they saw made Daniel's blood run cold. The parking area, he said. There are no cars. Tommy focused his binoculars on the employee parking area beside the main entrance. Jesus, it's completely empty. During normal operations, there should be at least 15 to 20 vehicles there. They've evacuated the facility. But why? The backup window is automated. It doesn't require personnel to be present. And if they were planning to relocate the program, they wouldn't just abandon the infrastructure. Daniel felt pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. Unless they know we're coming. Unless this is all a trap designed to draw us out into the open. Tommy's face went pale as the implications sank in. The children. If they've evacuated the staff, what happened to the children? Before Daniel could answer, Tommy's radio scanner crackled to life with urgent federal communications. Multiple teams were moving into position around the mountain, creating a containment perimeter designed to prevent anyone from escaping the area. They know exactly where we are, Tommy said grimly. This was never about stopping our surveillance operation. It was about capturing us. How much time do we have? Tommy studied the radio chatter, decoding the tactical communications with expertise born of years of monitoring federal operations. Maybe 30 minutes before the perimeter is complete. After that, we're trapped. Daniel looked down at the empty facility, understanding now that they'd been outmaneuvered by an enemy who'd had 28 years to study Tommy's methods and anticipate his actions. Agent Collins hadn't just been trying to capture a fugitive, he'd been orchestrating an elaborate trap. We abort, Daniel said. We get out of here right now and regroup. No. Tommy's voice was quiet but absolutely determined. We go down there and find out what happened to those children. Tommy, it's a trap. They want us to... I don't care what they want. Tommy was already disconnecting his equipment, but instead of packing it for retreat, he was reconfiguring it for a different purpose. 18 children were in that facility 3 days ago. Now the place is empty. Where are they? Daniel realized what his son was planning. You want to break into the facility. I want to access their computer systems from inside the building. The backup protocols I've been monitoring, they're not for off-site storage. They're for transferring data to a new location. If they've moved the program, there will be records of where the children were taken. This is suicide, Tommy. Even if we get inside, we'll never get out. Tommy finished his preparations and looked at his father with an expression that was heartbreakingly familiar. The same stubborn determination that 6-year-old Tommy had shown when he'd decided to build the world's biggest blanket fort. Dad, I've spent 28 years preparing for this moment. Not just the surveillance and the evidence gathering, but this, the chance to actually save those children instead of just documenting their suffering. I can't walk away now, Daniel understood. For Tommy, this wasn't about survival or escape. It was about the promise he'd made to himself during all those years in the wilderness that he would find a way to prevent other children from experiencing the hell he'd endured. All right, Daniel said quietly. But we do this smart. We get in, get the information, and get out before the perimeter closes. Tommy nodded and pulled something from his pack, a keycard he'd acquired during one of his previous infiltrations. This will get us through the main entrance. After that, we'll have maybe 20 minutes before their automated security systems detect the unauthorized access and alert the response. Teams, they abandoned the surveillance equipment and began making their way down the ridge toward the facility. The descent was faster but more dangerous, requiring them to move quickly over terrain that offered little concealment from observation. As they approached the main entrance, Daniel got his first close look at the building that had haunted his son's life for nearly 3 decades. It was larger than it appeared from the ridge, with multiple levels extending deep into the mountainside. The architecture was utilitarian and intimidating, designed to project authority rather than welcome visitors. Tommy used the stolen keycard to bypass the main security lock, and they slipped inside just as Daniel's radio scanner picked up the first reports of the containment. Teams reaching their assigned positions. The interior of the facility was exactly as sterile and oppressive as Daniel had imagined. Fluorescent lighting reflected off polished concrete floors and institutional green walls. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something medical and vaguely threatening that made Daniel's skin crawl. "This way," Tommy whispered, leading them deeper into the complex with the confidence of someone who'd studied every corridor and memorized every floor plan. They descended through 2 levels, passing empty laboratories and abandoned office spaces that showed signs of hasty evacuation. But it was on the 3rd level that they found what they were looking for, and what they found was worse than anything Daniel had imagined. The holding cells were empty, but the evidence of what had been done there was impossible to ignore. Restraint systems built into hospital beds, monitoring equipment designed to track vital signs during extreme stress. And on the walls, scratched messages left by children who'd known they might never see the outside world again. "Help me," read one message, carved into the concrete with fingernails. "My name is Katie and I live in Ohio," read another. Tommy stood in the center of the holding area, his hands clenched into fists, his whole body shaking with rage and grief. "They were here," he said quietly. "All those children. They were right here." Daniel found the computer terminal that controlled the facility's data systems. "Can you access their records from here?" Tommy sat down at the terminal and began working with swift practice keystrokes. Within minutes, he'd penetrated the facility's security and was downloading files at a furious pace. "Got it," he said finally. "Transportation orders dated 2 days ago. All subjects transferred to a facility in Nevada. Something called the Desert Research Institute. Can you copy everything?" "Already doing it." Tommy was transferring files to multiple storage devices simultaneously. "But Daniel, there's something else. Something you need to see." On the computer screen was a personnel file that made Daniel's blood freeze. The photo showed Agent Collins, but the attached information revealed that his involvement in the program went back decades, all the way to the original Millbrook operation. "He was there," Tommy said quietly. "When I was 6 years old, Agent Collins was one of the people who authorized my abduction. He's not just trying to cover up current crimes, he's trying to protect himself from prosecution for what he did to me 28 years ago." The sound of helicopters approaching cut short their investigation. The containment teams had finished deploying, and now they were moving in for the capture. The sound of boots in the upper corridors told them they had minutes, not hours, before the facility was completely overrun by federal agents. Tommy worked frantically at the computer terminal, downloading everything he could access, while Daniel kept watch at the corridor entrance. "How much more do you need?" Daniel asked urgently. "Almost finished. Just need to transmit everything to Helen's communication hub." Tommy's fingers flew across the keyboard as he established a connection to the hunting cabin where their team was waiting. The transmission began just as the first federal agents reached the 3rd level. Daniel could hear their tactical communications echoing through the empty corridors. Teams moving in coordinated patterns, sealing off escape routes, preparing to corner their quarry in the deepest levels of the facility. "Tommy, we need to move now. 30 more seconds." Tommy was watching a progress bar crawl across the computer screen, each percentage point representing evidence that could save the lives of 18 children. 20 seconds. The sound of running feet was getting closer. Daniel could see flashlight beams dancing at the far end of the corridor, moving systematically from room to room as the agents searched for their targets. 10 seconds. Daniel drew the pistol he'd brought from Martha's cabin, an old hunting weapon that he hadn't fired in years but still knew how to use. He wasn't going to shoot at federal agents, but he might be able to use the threat of violence to buy Tommy the time he needed to complete the transmission. Done. Tommy yanked the storage devices from the computer and shoved them into his jacket. "Everything's uploaded. Helen has all the evidence she needs." They ran for the emergency exit Tommy had identified during his reconnaissance, but they were too late. Agent Collins and 3 other men were already blocking their escape route, weapons drawn and ready. Thomas Cole, Collins said, his voice calm and professional despite the circumstances. "You've led us quite a chase over the years." Tommy stepped protectively in front of his father, though Daniel was the one holding the gun. "Where are the children, Collins? Safe and receiving proper care at a secure facility. The kind of care you needed but were too stubborn to accept. You mean the kind of care that turns children into broken shells of human beings. The kind of care that destroys their minds and replaces their personalities with whatever serves your purposes." Collins' expression didn't change. "You were always an exceptional subject, Thomas. Even after all these years, you demonstrate remarkable resilience and problem-solving abilities. The work we did with you was quite successful." Successful? Tommy's voice was deadly quiet. "You tortured me for months. You destroyed my childhood, my relationship with my family, my ability to trust or connect with other human beings. You call that successful? I call it necessary. The techniques we developed using you and the other subjects have applications that could save thousands of lives. Military personnel who need to resist enemy interrogation. Intelligence operatives who require the ability to compartmentalize traumatic experiences. Civilian populations who might benefit from therapeutic memory modification." Daniel felt sick as he realized the scope of what Collins was describing. "You're talking about mind control on a massive scale. I'm talking about tools that could eliminate post-traumatic stress, reduce the impact of psychological warfare, and provide treatment options for severe mental illness. The research conducted at Millbrook and its successor facilities represents decades of breakthrough work in human psychology. Built on the suffering of children," Tommy said, "built on necessary sacrifices made for the greater good. Thomas, you of all people should understand. Your experience, difficult as it was, contributed to developments that could help millions of people." Tommy stepped closer to Collins, ignoring the weapons pointed at him. "Those children in Nevada, what are you doing to them?" "Perfecting the process. Reducing the trauma, increasing the success rate, developing more efficient methods of achieving the desired psychological modifications. Each generation of subjects teaches us how to improve our techniques. You're never going to stop, are you? There will always be more children, more experiments, more necessary sacrifices for your greater good." Collins nodded slightly. "The work is too important to abandon because of sentimental concerns about individual subjects. But Thomas, you could help us improve the process. You could ensure that future subjects experience less trauma while still achieving the desired outcomes. Your cooperation could literally save lives." Daniel realized what Collins was offering, a chance for Tommy to become part of the program that had destroyed his childhood, to help refine the techniques that would be used on other children. "Never," Tommy said simply. "Then you leave us no choice but to continue without your input. The Nevada facility will proceed with its current protocols, regardless of the psychological cost to the subjects." Tommy was quiet for a moment, and Daniel could see him calculating odds and considering options. When he spoke again, his voice was steady and determined. "There's something you don't know, Collins. Something your intelligence network missed. What's that?" Tommy smiled, and for the first time since their reunion, Daniel saw genuine happiness in his son's expression. "We already won," Collins frowned. "What do you mean?" "While we were having this conversation, Helen Price has been transmitting our evidence to news organizations in 6 different countries. By morning, every major newspaper and television network in the world will have detailed documentation of your program, including the current location of those 18 children. That's impossible. We've been monitoring all communications in this area. You've been monitoring communications that you know about. But Helen's using satellite uplinks and secure channels that you've never detected. Right now, as we speak, journalists are filing stories that will expose everything. Millbrook, the Nevada facility, your role in both operations, and the current illegal detention of those children." Collins' confident expression began to crack. "Even if that's true, we can discredit the sources, claim the evidence is fabricated. Maybe you could discredit one source or even a few sources. but 6 countries worth of independent journalism, all releasing the same evidence simultaneously, all corroborated by government documents stolen from your own computers. That's going to be a lot harder to explain away. Daniel watched Colin's face as the implications sank in. The agent was realizing that his carefully planned trap had itself been trapped, that while he'd been focusing on capturing Tommy and Daniel, their real objective had been achieved by people he didn't even know existed. Besides, Tommy continued, there's one more thing you haven't considered. What? Tommy pulled out his phone and held it up so Collins could see the screen. It was displaying a live video feed, the interior of the facility where they were currently standing, with Collins and his men clearly visible, streaming live to Helen's communication hub, which is retransmitting it to our media contacts around the world. Right now, thousands of people are watching you threaten a father and son who exposed your illegal human experimentation program. Collins raised his weapon, his professional composure finally cracking. Turn it off. Can't do that. The transmission is automated. Even if you kill me, it will continue broadcasting until the battery dies. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself beside his son in a gesture of solidarity that had been 28 years in the making. It's over, Collins. The program is finished. Those children will be found and rescued, and you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison for what you've done. Collins looked around at his men as if considering whether to order them to open fire despite the live video feed. But even he could see that killing his captives on camera would only make the scandal worse. The sound of helicopters outside grew louder. But these weren't more federal agents coming to reinforce Collins' position. According to the radio chatter on Tommy's scanner, they were news crews arriving to cover the breaking story of illegal government experimentation. On American children, the trap had indeed been sprung, but Agent Collins and his program were the ones who'd been caught. 6 months later, Daniel sat on the front porch of the small cabin he'd rented in the mountains, watching his son work in the garden they'd planted together. The tomatoes were coming in well, and Tommy had shown an unexpected talent for coaxing vegetables from the Rocky Mountain soil. It was quiet, peaceful work that seemed to help with the nightmares that still came sometimes. The congressional hearings had lasted 3 months, with Tommy providing testimony that had resulted in the arrest of 17 federally officials and the complete dismantling of what the media had dubbed the Millbrook program. Agent Collins was awaiting trial on charges that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. Dr. Whitman, the director of the Nevada facility, had already been convicted and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. More importantly, all 18 children had been rescued from the Nevada facility within hours of Helen's story breaking internationally. The children were now receiving proper medical care and therapy, with victim advocates working to reunite them with their families wherever possible. Tommy was slowly adapting to life around other people, though it remained a daily challenge. He'd agreed to work with therapists who specialized in treating survivors of extreme trauma, and he was making progress in rebuilding his capacity for human connection. Some days were better than others. Sarah visited every few weeks, driving up from Virginia with home-cooked meals and patient determination to rebuild some kind of relationship with the son she'd lost and found again. The 3 of them were learning to be a family, not the family they'd been before, but something new that acknowledged both the love that had survived and the damage that couldn't be undone. "Dad?" Tommy called from the garden, holding up a particularly large tomato. "Look at this one!" Daniel smiled and walked over to admire his son's handiwork. Tommy was 34 years old now, but there were moments, like this one, when Daniel could see traces of the 6-year-old boy who'd loved showing off his treasures. "That's a beauty," Daniel said. "Your mom's going to be impressed when she sees it." Tommy nodded, carefully placing the tomato in the basket he'd woven from mountain willow. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "The other survivors, the kids from the original Millbrook who escaped or were transferred to other facilities. We found some of them during the investigation, but there are probably others still out there." People like me who've been living in hiding for decades. Daniel understood where this was leading. You want to help find them. I want to help them find their way back to their families, if that's what they want. Or just help them find their way back to the world. I know what it's like to be alone and scared, and not know how to trust anyone. Daniel considered this. Over the past 6 months, Tommy had received dozens of letters from other survivors of government experimentation programs, people who'd recognized themselves in his testimony and wanted to share their own stories. Tommy had responded to every letter personally, offering support and understanding to people who'd never found anyone who truly comprehended what they'd experienced. That sounds like important work, Daniel said. It would mean traveling sometimes, meeting with people in different states, helping them navigate the legal system or the therapy process, or just sitting with them while they remember things they've tried to forget. And you think you're ready for that? Tommy was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think I'm ready to try. I can't undo what happened to me, but maybe I can help prevent other people from going through it alone, the way I did. Daniel felt a surge of pride in his son, not just for the man he'd become despite everything he'd endured, but for his determination to transform his suffering into service to others. I'd like to help, Daniel said. If you want a partner. Tommy's smile was answer enough. That evening, Sarah arrived for her weekly visit, bringing with her a surprise guest, Helen Price, who'd won another Pulitzer Prize for her investigation of the Millbrook program. I have something for you, Helen said, pulling out a manila envelope. The first copies of the book. Inside the envelope were advance copies of The Children of Millbrook, A Father's Search and a Son's Survival, the book Helen had written documenting their story. Tommy's name appeared as co-author, and all proceeds from the book were designated for a foundation they'd established to help survivors of government experimentation programs. Daniel opened the book to the dedication page and felt his throat tighten as he read, "For all the children who were taken and for the families who never stopped looking." There's something else, Helen said. The publisher wants to arrange a book tour, television interviews, speaking engagements, meetings with other survivor advocacy groups. Are you interested? Tommy looked at Daniel, then at Sarah, then back at Helen. Will it help other people? It will raise awareness, generate funding for survivor services, and put pressure on the government to declassify records from other similar programs. So yes, I think it will help. Then we'll do it, Tommy said simply, as the evening wore on. Daniel found himself sitting on the porch with Sarah while Tommy and Helen discussed plans for the book promotion. It was the most comfortable conversation he'd had with his ex-wife in 20 years. He's healing, Sarah said quietly, watching Tommy through the window as he explained something to Helen with animated gestures. Slowly, but he's healing. We all are, Daniel replied. It's going to take time, but we're finally moving in the right direction. Sarah reached over and took Daniel's hand, the first voluntary physical contact between them since their divorce. Thank you. For what? For never giving up. For finding him. For bringing our son home. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. We brought him home. All of us together. Later that night, after Helen and Sarah had left, Daniel and Tommy sat by the fire pit they'd built behind the cabin. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and the only sounds were the crackling of burning wood and the distant call of an owl. Dad? Tommy said quietly. Yeah? I've been thinking about something else. Something I wanted to ask you. Daniel waited. That last night before they took me, do you remember what we talked about around the campfire? Daniel smiled at the memory. You asked me if I thought there were other planets with kids like you on them. And I said that if there were, I hoped their dads loved them as much as I loved you. And then you said something else. Something about how love doesn't disappear, even when people are far apart. I remember. Tommy was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I held on to that during the worst times at Millbrook. When they were trying to make me forget who I was, I would remember you saying that love doesn't disappear. It got me through. Daniel felt tears building behind his eyes. I'm glad. I wanted you to know that it worked. Your love, It never disappeared. Even when I couldn't remember your face or your voice, I could still feel that you loved me. And that feeling kept me human when they were trying to turn me into something else. Daniel reached over and put his arm around his son's shoulders. And for the first time in 28 years, Tommy didn't tense up at the contact. Instead, he leaned into his father's embrace like the child he'd once been. "I love you too, Dad," Tommy said quietly. "And I'm ready to come home now." All the way home. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to a father and son who'd found their way back to each other across 28 years of darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The book tour, the advocacy work, the slow process of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by evil men with good intentions. But tonight, they were simply a family again. Different than they'd been before, marked by scars that would never fully heal, but whole in the way that truly matters. The children of Millbrook had finally come home.